And Marco Ferroni. So, Raj, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dave, for giving me this opportunity. I also thank Billy for having asked me to switch over and take over this particular session. Following the scene that has already been set in the inaugural session relating to the theme of this particular symposium, which I would just again like to emphasize as to how can smallholder farming feed the world and promote economic growth. Today, in this particular session, we again have two eminent speakers. They are on the podium, Dr. Veena Agarwal and Dr. Ferroni. They are going to present two different perspectives relating to this particular project. One is in the context of socio-economic and policy aspects relating to smallholder farming as to how they can improve the economy and improve livelihood of resource-poor farmers in the arid tropics. And Marco would give a perspective from the private sector side as to what role the private sector can play. So we have definitely two different aspects to be covered, and in terms of housekeeping, we have 30-minute presentation by each of them. We are late by half an hour, but that doesn't mean we will cut short on this particular session. But we would have half an hour for discussion after the two key speakers have made their presentation. So I would like to first introduce Dr. Veena Agarwal. She is an accomplished economist. She is a professor of economics at the Institute of Economic Growth at Delhi University. She is also president of the International Society for Ecological Economics. She has written extensively on agriculture, food security, and rural transformation. Among her best known works are the National Award-winning book, A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia. And the recent one is with regard to gender and green governance. She was honored by the President of India in 2010 with a prestigious national award known as Padma Shri. So I would not like to take long and be in between her and you, but would request her to give us her presentation.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here. Dr. Dhar, Dr. Housington, and all the friends of ICRISAT and those in ICRISAT. I think 40 years is a wonderful age to be. You've had garnered enough experience, and you also have all the energy to take things forward. So I do wish a happy birthday, ICRISAT. I'm actually a great fan of ICRISAT. I last visited it, of course, a long time ago, around 1999. But I've used ICRISAT's work and known its data sets for a very long period of time, from NS Jodha, who used it very effectively to to talk about valuing the commons, a very much cited paper by Ryan and Walker on employment and the links between agriculture and non-agriculture in the 80s. The ongoing, a lot of other work by Mark Rosenweig and Hans Binswanger and many others. So I think apart from the scientific aspect of what we've seen this morning, there is a huge body of work done at ICRISAT, panel data following villages over a period of time, which is quite unique and which has also been quite uniquely used. I will talk about, it was quite a challenge to decide what exactly to focus on. It's such a wide field. So here are some, here is my attempt. I actually need a bit of light here. The funny thing is this, we are a little light. Well, there are two swimming sunlight. This is just something to read. Let us find notes. I can't actually see my notes. Okay. Now there are two divergent views of agriculture that prevail today. One is that agriculture is a drag on growth, and that small farmers in particular, they have low yields, they have non-viable holdings, and they really need to move out of farm into non-farm and urban context. And you actually have China building large cities in order to do precisely that. The alternative view of agriculture, which we've seen this morning as well, is that agriculture is an opportunity, that small farmers can be drivers of growth, that they need support, agrarian reform, infrastructure. We didn't hear a lot about institutional innovation, but I'll fill the gap. But that they should be able to move out, but much more on their own terms. Now, which perspective, how you view agriculture and smallholder farming depends very much on which view you subscribe to. Globally, of course, agriculture we know contributes. Its contribution has been declining in terms of its contribution to GDP, and as you can see from this graph, except for Sub-Saharan Africa, you have vast declines in its contribution to GDP. However, the share of agriculture in terms of absorbing labor and employment still remains quite high, and especially the two regions we've been talking about this morning, which is Asia, but especially South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is okay. So there we are. So much for technology. And so it is precisely this. It's precisely this gap, which is that you have a rather small proportion agriculture contributing rather a small share of the GDP, but you have a very high proportion dependent on agriculture. And this is seen as a divergence. And really, agrarian change should bring about a convergence over time. Now, agriculture, I won't go into too much of this, but what you see is that not only is a large proportion of people still dependent on agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but a large increasing proportion of female. And you see that there's a gradual move, except for in this Europe, the proportion of women in agriculture is increasing. Here are some cases from across women farmers and so on. Now, of course, classically, agriculture was supposed to play a very significant role in economic development in all sorts of ways, supplying surplus labor, food, markets for goods that industry produces, savings for industrial investment, foreign exchange for exports, and of course, improve food security and provide price stability, reduce poverty, about which we've heard this morning, and increase non-farm employment and growth via various linkages. Now, in fact, what you find is that this is empirically also slides you've shifted, I'll put it on there. Empirically also, you find that there's quite a lot of cross-country research which indicates that agricultural growth plays a very important role in terms of overall growth of the economy. And there's a positive relationship between agricultural growth and food security, and a positive relationship between agricultural growth and poverty reduction. There's a recent, rather splendid study and attempt at modeling which was done by Kiran Parekh, Hans-Bin Swanger and others. It isn't yet out, but I was privileged to hear it last year, which also shows that the total factor productivity, if you really want, for instance, if India wants to grow at 8%, its GDP to grow at 8%, its total factor productivity and, of agriculture should actually grow at least at 2%. At the moment, it's 1.5. And if you want a 10% rate of growth, then you need agriculture, the total factor productivity to grow at 3%. So this is another way to put forward some of the challenges that we face. But then the question is, who in agriculture is going to play the role? Is it middle and large farmers, or is it really the smallholder that we've been talking about? Now there is, of course, as I said, divergent views on this, but there is also enough evidence to talk about the fact that it is the smallholder which needs to and must play the role. But smallholders face multiple constraints. Who is the smallholder in India? Some of what I say I hope will be relevant for other parts of the world, but my brief was to focus especially on Indian evidence. Now, farmers here cultivating 2 hectares or less accounted for 83% of operational holdings and 41% of operated area. So they really are small. And the average size of holding is 1.33 hectares. The marginal and small farmers also, since many of them are landless or near landless, they also account for a fair proportion of the leased in area, 35%. Indeed, 36% of tenant households are landless, and 48% own less than or equal to 0.5 hectares. Now, the other side of this is the social disadvantage that much larger proportion of the smallholders are scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and relative to the larger farmers. And almost 40% of the labor force is female. So basically what you get is the size, caste, gender, and often also locational, because there's a concentration of smallholders, especially in certain regions, in particular the Northeast. Now, most of the smallholders face a whole range of constraints. Poor land access, credit access, access to critical inputs, especially irrigation and water, power, seeds, fertilizer. We've heard a lot about that. There's been a neglect in extension services and crop research, when it reaches the crops that they grow. The high production risk, little insurance coverage, and limited market access. Now, all of these, I think, are extremely important because, of course, all the market access is important in the output end. It's also important in terms of the inputs that farmers use. Now, I want to focus especially on some of the difficulties that the farmers face. I'll do a very quick overview of these constraints and then talk about where we might move from here. The land, of course, is a very important constraint. And to think about the land constraint, it's not just the amount of land, but the quality of land, the absence of water, and so on. Small size has other constraints because it reduces your ability to invest in lumpy inputs. For instance, if you want to invest in irrigation and so on, there are serious diseconomies of scale, difficulties of moving to higher value crops to take up contract farming. And there was a recent study by Foster and Rosenwein, which showed that large farms have higher profits per acre, and they have a positive scale effect, particularly through credit access and access to various inputs. Now, the received wisdom was that size and productivity were inversely related. But in fact, when you look at profits per hectare, you find that that is not the case. The lack of title, we also know, with farmers reduces your ability to get access to formal credit, and it has other disincentive effects. So, for instance, this rather startling result showed that productivity is 15 to 30% lower on rented plots relative to own plots of the same farm. I believe this was data, ICRISAT data, which was used where you could have information of a farmer who was both using his own or her own plot and also leasing it. And so you get these disincentive effects. Leasing, we know, is on insecure terms. I'll come back to that. The lease periods are short, and leasing, of course, is in terms of the law, is illegal in many states of India. So overcoming the land constraint is a major challenge. It may not be a sufficient condition, but it seems to be a very necessary condition to overcome land constraints. Just quickly, I won't go through every bit of what I show you on the screen, which I'm sure you can very quickly read it. For instance, in a much smaller percent, MNS and SMM are used percentages. MNS is marginal and small farmers. SM, S and M, I think somewhere in the slides is that, are small and marginal farmers. I'll also use the term D and W farmers, which is disadvantaged and women farmers. So do forgive me these acronyms very well. So these figures just show that the small and marginal farmers have much less access to formal credit institutions, and if you're also low caste, if you're women, then this is you're even worse off. And what is important to see is that small and marginal farmers actually depend much more on cooperative credit, but the borrowing from cooperative credit institutions has been falling over time. For instance, it fell from 60% in 2008 to 50% in 2009. And although government has priority sector lending, it works very differently on the ground. I won't talk much about irrigation because one could have at least several presentations on irrigation, but that's really a huge disequalizer. Extension, again, we can talk about extension, but really the challenge is how are you going to reach the small farmers and how are you going to in particular reach the women farmers. Now, some of you might remember, I don't know how many might remember, that in Krishi Darshan programs on Indian TV, they used to have these pink turbaned male farmers who would sit down and chat with the extension officers. But the face of the farmer has changed. I mean, now you'll have a woman who's covered her head. She's a farmer, and she needs to be reached. And she will not be reached. She's not the pink turban farmer. So this is, I think, a real challenge. Whose fields do you actually do your crop experiments on? There's quite a lot of evidence emerging to show that if you do it on the fields of the farmers or nearby, small farmers, women farmers, then it has much greater impact on acceptance information. There's issues of crop insurance, marketing, everybody's favorite. But only 18% of marginal farmers, according to this, took advantage of marketing cooperatives relative to 37% of the larger farmers. Now, contract farming, retail chains, these are very much the flavor of the discussions and policy debates today. But the fact is that contract farming, the majority of the tie-ups are with middle and large farmers, and in the agriculturally developed states, Punjab, Haryana, Gujarat, and so on. Corporates also prefer large farmers because they have the capacity. They have the capacity to supply high quality crops, to access transport and storage, to bear the risk of crop failure. And small farmers are rather rarely approached unless the region is dominated by how they grow a particular crop or they have by the government. Retail chain penetration, again, you find that it's really favors larger farmers. In fact, organic farming is another, there's studies on that which show the same kind of bias. So here is a challenge when we talk about market linkages. However, despite these constraints, smallholders produce 41% of India's total grain and over half of its fruits and vegetables. We also know that women farmers, there's a growing amount of evidence. I come together for a recent paper on food security of the evidence on comparing women farmers and male farmers in different countries. Most of the evidence comes from sub-Saharan Africa, but there is also some evidence from Asia. But what that consistently shows is two sorts of things. That once you control for inputs, there are major disadvantages that women farmers face in terms of inputs, access to extension, land. Once you control for that, they're not less efficient. But if you don't control for that, the fact is that they're disadvantaged in that respect. So if we link that fact up with the growing feminization of agriculture, then you're not going to win on other fronts unless you actually pick up the challenge of reaching women farmers. Now, the FAO's 2011 report, State of Agriculture report, actually assessed that if the gap, the inequality gap in terms of access to inputs and so on between male and women farmers was bridged, then it would increase growth, agricultural growth in developing countries from anything between 2.5 to 4%. So that would be a huge contribution just by equalizing or moving inputs from to women farmers, and sometimes even moving inputs from overuse of fertilizer and so on, from male farmers fields to women's farmers, simply because you're on the downward sloping part of the marginal productivity. What I will do, where do we go from here? What can be done? What should be done? What can be done? These are not all the same things, but let's talk about it. My main focus will be on two aspects. One will be on the land constraint, and the second will be on institutional issues, and what I call a group approach to increasing access to inputs and support services to make the smallholder more dynamic and much, if you like, not just market oriented, but diverse, all the more resilient, if you like. Now on land, what can we do about land? There are many things that one can do about land. There is the whole issue of giving land, transferring land by the government, facilitating land purchases, facilitating land leasing, protecting smallholders from indiscriminate land acquisition for non-agricultural use, and of course improving land records, which by the way is not just academic exercise, but very, very important for ensuring security of trade. What can it, the state can do something about transferring land to the landless, but can do only so much because the amount of surplus land that they could identify, they haven't identified all of it. There have been civil society groups like Ekta Parishad, which have been doing this at the moment, walking across the country to identify surplus land. And the Prime Minister set up a council, National Council, to look into that. But facilitating land purchase and facilitating land leases is the way in which a lot of policy has been, thinking has been going. Now, facilitating land purchase, there are examples of success stories here of starting loan come purchase schemes. And one example is really Andhra Pradesh, the state where we are currently standing. In the 1980s, when the government started this scheme of 50% loan, 50% grant, and low interest loan to poor Dalit women who, if they came together as a group. And I'll come back to that of how some NGOs have helped use that scheme creatively. What it should not do, and which comes up periodically, is to lease land to disadvantaged and women farmers. Because if you purchase land and then lease it out, basically you're entering the land market, and that really shouldn't be what the government is doing, because then what it does is it will hike up land prices and adversely affect poor farmers who are outside that particular scheme. Land leasing, however, is something which is very much a reality. We've been talking about this legally when land reform took place in India. They said, well, land to the tiller and tenancy and leasing in was not legal in many states. But we've been talking about leasing for a very long period of time, at least since the late 80s. I remember a very large meeting in the Planning Commission where the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Planning were present, and 30 or 40 of us. But the difficulty with leasing has been always that if you formalize leasing, then the landlord feels that he or she will lose the land to the tenant because of the nature of laws. Now, Andhra Pradesh recently has been discussing this self-help group tenancy bill. And there are a number of flaws in this. One flaw is that it is talked about a group leasing of land. But it also says that you can sublease it within the group, which is an individual owner could then lease it. And it seems to me that's the wrong way to go because it will fragment the land, and there's no reason why a group should take liability for if one person defaults. The other thing which has happened is that apparently it has not allayed the fears of the landowners, and what it's led to is I'm really I'm going to program again. I started. Yeah, start for so here's an idea which I want to put across. It's been distributed to you, which is the public land bank idea, and this is something we mooted as chairing a working group on disadvantaged farmers, including women, in the planning commission for the 12th plan. And the idea is that if you set up at the panchayat level something equivalent to a land bank, where all those who have surplus land who want to lease it out actually deposit it in the land for one season or a year or more. And the land, you get a small return on it, like you do in a financial bank, you get a small return depending on the period for which you deposit it. And the people who want to lease the land in are then able to come in and then say, okay, we want, this is what's available. And sometimes you may be able to get a contiguous plot. And at that point, depending on the quality of the land, the owner of the land also gets a return, a proportion of the lease. Now, the benefits of this to the owners would be initial payment on deposit, additional rent when the land gets leased out. The development of the land is possible, for instance, soil conservation, including through NREGA. And it guarantees a return to the owners, even owners, as we know, many owners are no longer, the children are no longer able to farm, so people are going to move out. For the person leasing in, of course, it gives a guaranteed lease for a reasonable, possibly a producible size. Now, what this could do is to match supply and demand for land in a rationalized way, which we don't have. And what it will not do is create rights over the land of the tenant, because basically you're going through the bank. So you're not going to lose it out, you're not going to lose the land if you're an owner. And you do it voluntarily, so you could always withdraw the land if you so wish. So in any case, this is an idea which has produced a degree of interest in the states, in ANDHRA, in Kerala, in Maharashtra, and I hope we'll have some discussion on this. What we've suggested in this, however, is that the land should not be leased to corporates and to large farmers, that it should really be leased to smallholders and to groups of male and female farmers. The second part of my thrust of my argument here will be to talk more about the group approach to small farmer cooperation. And this could be at two levels. It could be partial cooperation, for instance, in helping access land, in crop planning, invest in inputs like irrigation, soil conservation, and marketing. Or it could be what I call fully integrated cooperation, which is land pooling and joint cultivation. The second is, of course, much more of a challenge and much more controversial. The marketing part, of course, I think there's general agreement. I'll come back to that in a minute. But slightly higher up, just prior to marketing, there are examples of collective crop planning. Now, this could be nicely dovetailed with it's zonally done with the quality of the land and the ecological zones. The NGO Pradhan has been doing this in a number of states, and so many of you would have examples of this. Cooperative marketing, again, I'll go over this, I think in the next presentation there might be more on that. But producer companies is something which is very much being talked about. The producer company idea at one end of the spectrum is that let's look at the company laws and actually talk about it being registered. I think there are 130 such at this point. There aren't a large number. But the idea of a producer company, if you also bring in informal farmers associations, for a start, is something which is very much talked about. And I've seen it just last month, Safal, I looked at it, Safal is a sub-branch of Mother Dairy, Amul, and they, you can see all the way down from informal farmers associations to the final end of the value chain, which is the retail shops. And other examples. The second, which is, I said, somewhat more contentious, is the idea of comprehensive group cooperation, which is group farming. And now, group farming would have a large number of potential gains. It gives you more arable land if you actually pool your land, given that, as I said, 1.33 acres, hectares is a very small plot. It brings economies of scale. There can be labor sharing, better access to credit inputs and information, risk sharing. This is very, very important because coming together would give you much more bargaining power. In the morning, we heard about that with government, with markets, and with private contractors. It gives a greater diversity of skills. It's nobody's case that every farmer in India has all the diversity of skills, but certainly if you have a group, you'll have a diversity of skills and knowledge. Less social and economic isolation in terms of farmer suicides, perhaps, and then protection against land grabs. Now, what I want to argue here is that the idea of land pooling and collective farming has earned a very bad name, and it has earned a bad name because of the history of collectivization, those socialist experiments in the USSR, China, and elsewhere, which had serious implications, negative implications for welfare and also productivity. We also had experiments in Africa and in India. We had cooperatives. We were talking about cooperatives in the 50s. And generally, if you ask, I'm sure half the audience, if I ask, it's, oh, well, cooperative doesn't work, you've tried it and it's failed. The question is, on what principles did you actually build the cooperation? And did they follow what you would expect for success? Today, we know enough about both theoretically collective action theory, and we have enough ground examples, and we can certainly learn from common pool resource literature that there have to be certain principles for collectivity to work. And these are principles that are called out, which is voluntariness is absolutely essential. The early experiments were coercive. The small size, socio-economic homogeneity, participatory decision making, checks in free riding, that is, if somebody doesn't work, what do you do, and fair and transparent distribution. Now, is this theoretical? No, I'll give you, there are at least two kinds of examples of success stories on the ground. One is from the transition economies in Central Asia, and the other is from India, which is predominantly women's groups. And there are three examples here, from Andhra Pradesh and from Kerala. I'll skip over the example from Central Asia, but what is important to emphasize there was that after decollectivization in the 80s and 90s, people voluntarily reformed groups bottom up. And studies which have looked at the productivity of individual family farming and groups find that the productivity and efficiency of the groups, and these are small and they follow these principles, is much higher. The India examples, this is the earliest that I came across, the 80s, in which the Andhra Pradesh government's attempt to have the grant loan scheme for Dalit women, if they could purchase land as a group and also for leasing land, you found that that was creatively used by the Delhi Development Society to help women purchase land. The purchased land was listed in the names of individual women, but they cultivated it as a group. And it's unirrigated, they sometimes grow 24 crops, highly diverse, and by all accounts, it's organic farming. They preserve the seeds. Here's an example of a woman preserving the seeds. So this is on a, one might say that this is on a small scale. An alternative example is Kerala, which is on a large scale today. And we can talk about how do you scale up. But here, what you have is it's potentially this experiment was started by local government. It's in all 14 states. As you can see from the figures, there are 35,000 groups. What they did 2 years ago was link voluntarily made women's farmer groups and connected them with credit. So NABARD has this scheme of joint liability groups. And as a result of that, it's really been expanding It's brought in a lot of fallow land and current fallows and other fallows into cultivation. It's increased. There is an element of subsidy, but it's increased productivity. It's increased employment. Many women who were not working in the fields have come back because they're working in groups. They've also used Narega very creatively by linking it and reclaiming land which was inundated and out of cultivation. So here's an example. You remember the earlier picture I showed you of women farmers all bent double, and here you have an example of women using technology and standing up straight. Okay, there are other reasons why you can form groups. Let me conclude since my time has drawn to a close. That basically the argument is firstly that you cannot. We need to look at institutions. Markets are institutions, but to link people to markets, we have to think of a whole range of other institutions as well. And we need to get beyond technical fixes to look at the production process itself and what are the institutions that we need. Secondly, that land remains a major constraint, and we need to think of creative ways. The public land bank would be one way in which we could move forward. There could be other mechanisms for doing so. And thirdly, that for smallholder agriculture to become dynamic, cooperation is the key. And I think that should be the center stone of the new model. There is much work to be done in thinking through what enables farmers to cooperate. And there's a whole, there are both aspects of economic gain and efficiency to be brought in. Do they make a profit? Why should farmers come together unless they make a profit? In doing so, are they better off cooperating than not cooperating? But also is there social capital that is necessary prior to that, which enables people to trust each other. And I do believe this will make for a much more smoother transition out of farming in the long term, in which farmers can make the choices rather than be pushed by distress.
Thank you, Dr. Veena Agarwal, for highlighting the scope of smallholder farming for agricultural growth, especially in the context of Indian agriculture, and emphasizing very key issues. Also constraints and opportunities, which will, I'm sure, will be discussed when we open for the discussion of the second presentation. We have a second presentation by Dr. Marco Ferroni, who is the Executive Director of Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture, an expert in international agriculture and sustainability issues. Marco joined the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture as its Executive Director in 2008. After a career in multinational institutions and government, before joining the foundation, Marco held several positions at the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Earlier in his career, he worked for the government of Switzerland as a program director in economic affairs and international cooperation. Ferroni holds a doctoral degree in agricultural economics. We have both economics on my two sides from Cornell University, and he is presently based in Basel, Switzerland. So, Macro, we look towards you for your presentation related to the role of private sector.
Thank you very much, Raj. And probably it's a handicap the fact that in this panel, both of the speakers seem to be of the economics persuasion. My approach will be somewhat different from Veena's in the sense that I will be mostly speaking as a practitioner, but I think that you will find what I have to say quite convergent with what the previous speaker had to say, as well as with the previous presentations, the keynote speech, as well as Dr. Raj's presentation earlier on. I want to start, however, by thanking Drs. Dilidar and Dave Hoisings for inviting me to this very important discussion. And I'd like to, of course, not miss the chance to congratulate ICRISAT on its stellar achievements during the 40 years of work that it is now looking back on. This is what has distinguished ICRISAT in my mind over the years is that ICRISAT is not only about crop improvement research, but it's very much also about taking the goods to the farmer. And of course, ICRISAT is down in history in its with its work over decades, over the last 40 years, essentially in terms of developing and helping to create the Indian seed industry, make it get off the ground. This is extremely important in a systemically important country such as India, and there is much to learn from this experience as we work in Africa, addressing essentially the same kinds of problems. I would like to start, given that this is the title that the management has asked me to reflect on, and like Lina, I was a little bit at a loss at the beginning, because there's lots that can be said, and you have to be selective necessarily. So basically, I think it may be good for me to start with my basic premise, and that basic premise is that commercial agriculture is the best path to food security, poverty reduction, and agricultural development and growth. And in this model of commercial agriculture, the farmer, of course, is a commercially oriented, entrepreneurially minded entity that looks for value where they can get that value. Nobody has ever been a subsistence farmer by choice. But farm capabilities, and we've heard this in the previous presentation, as well as external factors beyond the farmer's control, vary widely, and this, of course, is what explains the wide range of outcomes out there that we can observe. I think that ICRISAT's strategy of inclusive, market-oriented development is exactly what we need to shape these outcomes in the desired way, benefiting farmers. I congratulate ICRISAT on opting for this strategy, because by opting for this strategy, ICRISAT signals correctly, in my view, that in today's day and age, and it may have been different during the Green Revolution period in a country such as our host country today, improvements in production require remunerative links to markets. As Dilidar has said, isolated techno-fixes do not do the trick by themselves. Why is it so? This is so because improvements in production typically require purchased inputs. And in order to finance purchased inputs, you've got to be able to sell. And also because improvements in production can very quickly lead to marketable surplus. If you cannot sell that defeats the purpose. There are numerous examples out there in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, to show that it is possible to remuneratively link small farmers to modern value chains. But markets are unpredictable in their nature, and they're volatile. And risks in agriculture abound. And so therefore some attempts at linking farmers to markets will fail and have failed. There are also numerous examples to show that the private sector is doing a better job in government, marketing inputs, and buying up farm outputs. But the private sector goes where there is a business case, and some farmers are not in that business case. Some cannot be in it, no matter what you do. Some others, however, can be in it, and I will talk about that a bit, what to do. We've already heard some very good suggestions from the previous speakers. Convert small farmers into business cases that are of, or business opportunities that are of interest to the private sector with the right kind of support. There is a lot of private sector involvement and at a growing rate in a country such as India, but we also see it elsewhere. We see it in Africa. It's basically a function of liberalization and economic growth. When you have those two things, and typically you don't have economic growth without the market and regulatory framework liberalization, that is when your agriculture begins to transform. That is when the private sector begins to come in. That is when farming can begin to become more commercial, even at the small farmer level. That transformation in India, I see 5 elements to it, and all of them have meaning with respect to the commercialization of agriculture, with respect to the scope for rising public sector intervention at the input and the output side of farming. First, we're seeing a process whereby value creation in agriculture is shifting from grains to high-value crops and livestock products. Transformation. Second, we see a situation where production based on low labor costs is evolving towards efficiency and productivity-driven patterns of production, and technology, including mechanization, is central to support that. We see a situation where natural resource constraints in this country and elsewhere are really beginning to be binding with respect to water, for example, and they will be addressed because they're binding. In fact, the climate change into that same discussion. And we see a situation where farming will increasingly shift from public support and protection to an ever greater involvement of the private sector in value chains. This, of course, then has major effects in terms of what the government's public policy stance ought to be. And I'll be addressing some of this, but let me just say very briefly, therefore, and then we can go through my slides very quickly. The basic message of this presentation is what you see projected. The private sector plays essential roles offering value to farmers. The private sector cannot, however, function on its own, and Hakim was very clear in his speech about this particular point. Public goods and what I call enabling institutions are indispensable companions, making the government's role therefore essential too. Partnerships are often needed to improve the functioning of value chains, to create synergy in agricultural R&D, and to shape social and environmental outcomes. By social outcomes, I mean in particular linking small farmers at the lower end of the size continuum and the farm capability continuum to modern value chains. And these are the topics that the set of slides is going to try to address very quickly. So basically, and since the title of the presentation was whatever it was to be saying how the private sector can be helpful to farmers or something like this. If you think about it, then farmers' needs are what define the private sector's role, because there is no business case unless you in the private sector unless you respond to effective demand. And effective demand is in the three spaces of technology, services, and access to markets. If you think about it, every farmer, female, male, large or small, irrespective of where they're located on the face of the earth, wants those three things: technology, services, and access to markets. Technology has everything to do, of course, with the four basic things that have made agriculture advanced over the decades, and that is germplasm, in other words, genetics, soil fertility solutions, crop protection, and irrigation and mechanization. Services have to do with agricultural extension. They have to do with better organization. I'm glad the previous speaker talked about that. They have to do with financial services, with connectivity, with information. And then, of course, access to markets, transport, storage, information, logistics. Now, it is the case today in emerging markets and developing countries that millions of small farmers are currently reached every day commercially as they buy seeds and crop protection products, fertilizers, cell phones, consumer goods, and tools. Cell phones, as you know, are an agricultural input. Now, here's the kind of a little bit of theoretical empirical proof for my argument that the private sector's role in agriculture is up. This is the data from India, and you see the curve there. Basically, this is investment, public investment, private investment, and total investment in agriculture at current prices over the long run here from the 1960s to the current period. And you can see how the private sector in the period since deregulation basically has exploded, mostly in particular in this, in the first decade of the 21st century. As a matter of fact, if you look at this, and you keep in mind what people in this room will know, I don't have the data to show it in this presentation, that if you think about how agricultural growth evolved in India, it is clear that there has been sort of a deceleration of growth from 1990 onwards for a while, and then there has been, after about 2005, a renewed acceleration. That renewed acceleration would have been much less without the private sector's role that is documented in this picture, and something similar can be said with respect to the opposite there of basically with respect to the first period of relative deceleration in growth since 1990, between 1990 and 2005. Now, what does this increased presence in agriculture, of the private sector in agriculture, do? It drives diversification. This is very much a smallholder friendly topic, diversification, because of the efficiency and effectiveness of small farms, particularly when it comes to the high value products. This is a set of tables that comes from a study by Joshi and Mr. Narayana. I don't know if they're making the group. This is one of the first things that this is that member of ICRISAT. Basically, what this says here is that diversification is an important source of agricultural growth with very sizable opportunities for smallholder farmers. I'm not going to go into it. You can look at the numbers later on and so on. This, however, this growth, like as I said in my introduction, this growing presence of the private sector in the agricultural economy poses dilemmas for the public sector in various domains. Certainly in service delivery. What's the topic with agricultural extension, which is the quintessential service that needs to be given to farmers? Because I will posit to you that knowledge is the first binding constraint. Even before the seed and other physical synthetic inputs, it's about knowledge, and then of course it's also coming back to this question of organization. And the literature on extension says that there are bright spots in extension in India, the rise of the private sector, the role of the NGOs, which I'm not talking about here, very important, and the role, of course, of mobile applications, cell phone technology, etc. What's not so good is the fact that many smallholder farmers are not reached at all, up to 60%, and the government's role, even though the government has huge public extension apparatus, at least on paper, its reach of farmers and small farmers is almost negligible, and it has, like the private sector, a larger farm bias in its extension program. So therefore, what are in this situation where you got the private for-profit and non-profit sector massively now present in extension, input dealers, lead partners, and so on, aggregators of products, and so on. What are the policy challenges and that the public sector clearly needs to be thinking about, and with respect to which incentives need to be created so that those policy challenges can be addressed increasingly by non-governmental actors? Those challenges are coverage of small farmers and the public sector's role and effectiveness in extension supporting the private sector and non-profits. Make the private sector go increasingly to the more marginal areas where it is currently not there. Similar set of comments apply to input supply. Seed systems, we have a vigorous private seed industry, of course, in this country, and this is true for other, as I'm saying, emerging markets also. And this rise of the private sector in the seed industry leads to numerous public-private interfaces where good practice and rules need to evolve, whether it be in acquisition of source seed, that is breeder and foundation, seed multiplication, quality control, conditioning and storage, and a number of other considerations. And the same thing, type of argument can be made with respect to agri-research. Agribusinesses in India are making major investments in research and producing innovations that are extremely important to farmers. About 70 companies, according to research we've done this year, are undertaking, spending money on agri-research in India at this time. This includes not just crop improvement, I mean, not just the genetics part, of course, hybrids and biotech and so on. It very much includes immunization, fertilization, crop protection, and so on. And this leads to this discussion, which is a long discussion that's been going on in the country, it's still going on, that says that public agri-research in this situation is at a crossroads. It looks back at a stellar past, but it needs renewal in the face of changed circumstances. One aspect, therefore, of those changed circumstances is the rise of the private sector, as well as in the context of the current newly pronounced, actually reconfirmed in the 12th plan, because it was already on the books in the 11th plan, ambitious agricultural growth rates of 4% per year. Major implications for research needs to develop technologies for dairy-fed agriculture, for the new dynamic types of agriculture as agriculture diversifies and so on. And this nowadays calls for public-private cooperation in agriculture. Didn't call for public-private cooperation in agriculture before the advent of the seed industry. Nowadays we have a situation where certainly in the modern, advanced methods and science of plant breeding, we clearly can see a division of capabilities between the public and the private sector, from which derives, in my analysis, a division of labor, which would then lead to the call for public-private cooperation. That division of capabilities has to do with genotyping and phenotyping, the latter being really a resource in the public sector, the former being much more nowadays present as a capability in the private sector. The two need to be brought together in the context of molecular breeding exercises and so on. And that is quintessentially there is a natural division of labor which leads to natural requirements for cooperation. The question is how, etc. Let me just sort of stop here and give you my intermediate conclusion. It's a brave new world out there in the sense that we have pervasive private sector presence, but there are still problems all the same, because we've got lots of small farmers that are still not linked to those markets. Many value chains do not function well, some don't function at all, and many farmers remain unreached. Now, some farmers cannot be reached. They're too poor, they're too far from markets. Commercial farming, you've got to recognize it, is simply not their ticket to prosperity. They cannot be helped as farmers. They need other public policy support. Narega is one example. Income transfer. You've got to recognize that. It is not productive to try to get the private sector to work with and for the poorest of the poor, because that cannot work. You've got to recognize that. However, in a world of growing markets, many of those who are currently unreached can be reached, can be linked to value chains if the applicable constraints are removed, if enablers, market makers are introduced, some of which a previous speaker has spoken about, some which are mentioned here in this picture, and so on. Now, there's quite a bit happening in India of late. There has been a lot happening actually almost for 20 years now in this space of private sector getting interested in seeing how they can work with small farmers co-creatively with the benefit in the end that we, the likes of us, want to see, which is linking farmers to markets for the purpose of improved welfare indicators at the level of those farmers. So currently, and we've done some work that our foundation is associated with the group that is linked to Harvard Business School and Enterprise Solutions for Poverty in New York and so on, whereby there are a number of corporates that are making renewed efforts these very days to bundle inputs, advice, markets, and money for the purpose of working with small farmers. What I have to tell you here is, however, that so far this experience, the illustrative list of companies, and some of them are both large corporates, including international or multinational corporates. There's no reason why the model is not applicable with and by domestic companies, and indeed a number of domestic companies, many in fact, are associated with the process. But what the previous picture showed, basically, I have to give you the caution that the caveat to the effect that is large or small farmers. Just for the reason that I mentioned before, it is difficult to bring small farmers, very small farmers, very low liquidity farmers to value chains. There is a plan underway now called Shared Value in Agribusiness platform in India. It's not off the ground yet, it's being prepared. These are some of the companies that have signed up to it, and they have a certain ambitious goal of reaching, all these ambitious of reaching 20 million farmers by 2020. Now, if you go to the lower level of farmers, the nature of intervention that we are always talking about, by definition, has something to do with what I projected here. We in our foundation work actively in this field. We have coined the term market-led extension. It is about extension, but it's in the end about much more than extension. It's about finance, it's about quality assurance, producing up to the food safety standards which modern supply chains demand. It's about technical support, it's about market linkages, and so on. And it is very much also about enablers, whether they be crop insurance, credit, finance, and so on. And my challenge that I'm facing in the work that we're doing in many countries, 14 countries as a matter of fact, across the so-called developing world, is how can I standardize the constituent elements of this approach so that I can thereby through standardization facilitate growing to scale. That's the challenge that I'm facing. It's not that we have not solved it. I think it's a challenge that many others are facing also. And if you have views about this, please give us an example of a project supported by Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture with local partners in Savar, India, northern Maharashtra, that does essentially market-led extension of the kind that I'm trying to very briefly present to you. Here are some highlights. I don't need to go through them. This project is, in terms of its effect on farmers, from what we can see, transformational in that the project has had production to come up. There is very much according to a model that we call producing together and selling together. Therefore, the organization is critical in this, and farmers are selling on spontaneous markets, making good income from what we can tell, and we have data to show it, as well as part of it is the model of contract farming, where some of the vegetables, chilies in particular, have been sold to FeedFresh. FeedFresh has told us that they can take unlimited quantities of chilies. Now that's an opportunity. I'll have to say to you and admit here in public that we're far from living up to that opportunity because of the organizational challenges, because of the, and so on, off the road, on the ground. But if a company, a large buyer, is telling you that we'll take unlimited quantities of chilies, now you tell me that's an opportunity for the smallholder farmers to market. And we're working on this in Savar. I mentioned enablers, and I don't have time to go into this, but I just wanted to mention one class of enablers called, obviously, mobile applications. This is something that our foundation has developed. It's going to go live towards the end of the year. We call it Farm Force, and it's really a mobile platform to support the integration of smallholder farmers into formal agro value chains. It's a platform. It's different from Salesforce. It's specifically designed to deal with large numbers of smallholder farmers and to reduce the transaction cost on that aggregator space and input company space as they deal with smallholder farmers. Basically, to enable fluid management of the three quintessential flows that always obtain: information flows, physical flows, and financial flows. I won't say more about this because I'm probably running out of time. And finally, it's all in the end about partnerships. I've heard this before. Partnerships come in many shapes, and they have many different types of participants, the PPPs, public-private, absolutely. Oftentimes we're seeing for-profit, non-profit partnerships where a commercial entity and a foundation, for example, the Gates Foundation, represented here is active in this, our foundation active in this, work together to accelerate research or kickstart markets that the purpose of which activity would be to benefit small-scale farmers. Now, given the fact that everybody is screening public-private partnerships in agriculture, and given the fact that we don't have many well-performing public-private partnerships in agriculture, we thought in Syngenta Foundation that we would come up with a knowledge management tool that we're calling APXC, Ag Partner Exchange. It has gone live in Ireland, this web address, since a few weeks ago this month. The purpose is for it to operate as a platform for knowledge management, as well as a platform for essentially as an incubator of public-private partnerships. I can tell you more if we have time about it during the discussion. The task is to stop, at least the challenge rather, to stop reinventing the wheel when we craft new partnerships in agriculture. So APXC, Ag Partner Exchange, is designed to change the name for PPPs in agriculture and make this whole world of PPPs in agriculture accelerate. Again, both in R&D, where of course the problematic and the nature of the participants is very sui generis, it's certainly different from the other grand class of problems where we need PPPs, which is the development of smallholder relevant markets on the input and the output side of farming. Therefore, to recapitulate, I just copy-pasted the first slide. This is what this world is all about. The private sector is important. The private sector, I predict, will be much more important in the context of economic growth that we see in Africa. We're now in the 10th year of positive per capita growth after a generation of stagnation. That transforms agriculture. It increases the markets for food, and it is on the back of that wave of growing food markets that we have a unique, historic, heretofore not existing chance to make a sizable and lasting contribution to the question of rural development and linking smallholder farmers to markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco, for very, very extensive coverage in the context of what private sector can do to empower small farmers. Now, both the presentations are open for any interventions from the house. I'm sure you have got very good coverage of various issues. From Meena relating to smallholder farmers and how they need to be empowered to play important role for agricultural growth. And also from Marco in the context of how private sector can help the smallholder farmers. So I now like maybe a few questions. Yes, Rodney?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you to the speakers. Marco, you underlined that public-private partnership is the way forward. The problem for many public sectors in many countries is to know where the private sector is most effective. One of your diagrams there in India, you split up the private sector interventions into technology, services, and access to markets. You then implied a little later that the extension is quintessential. Do you have any handle, at least in India, on which of the private sector interventions is most effective so that they should be catalyzed by the private sector? And linked to that is that new piece of software you just finished, APCX. Does that give us any clues in that direction? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll have response from both these speakers after 4 5 questions. Yeah. Could you please?
Yeah, I just have a question to Dina. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, both of you. I think the whole issue with land banks is a very interesting one. As we know, access to land is one of the limited, both access to land and the right to land is one of the limiting factors for increased productivity, poverty, real poverty reduction, and improved livelihoods. So I would like to know a little bit more about experiences, challenges. How can these groups or individuals have a bargaining power towards competing use of land? I mean, we have many strong forces in the society for a more so-called profitable use of land. We have agribusinesses, more profitable land agribusinesses. We have biofuel production. There are many, many factors that come in. So I would like to hear a little bit more about these bargaining possibilities, how it's solved, how groups are supported to be able to be in that position. But I think this is a very interesting. And as we know that in many African villages where I'm used to work in semi-arid areas, there are up to 40% of the households in villages that are either sharecroppers, have very small pieces of land. So it's not only 10%, it might be much more. And this could be a real solution. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your experiences.
Thank you, Senegal. Sapan?
Thank you. As Dr. Veena Agarwal talks about cooperative, and Marco was mentioning about the private sector's involvement. And I wonder whether consolidation of lands with the ownership remaining with the landowners. At the same time, the cooperative and private sectors both can be involved. And then a different transformation can take place. Can you find a model?
My appreciation to both the speakers for stimulating presentations. So my questions pertain to first question to Agarwal. You set an hypothesis that there is a positive relationship between agricultural growth and poverty reduction. So suppose for every 1% increase in the agricultural growth, what is the reduction in the poverty? Maybe if you can just some empirical evidences, that would be more interesting. And again, second, your land bank innovative approach is an excellent approach. But before proposing, we need to work out what is the transaction cost involved. Suppose if the transaction cost is clear, then whatever the benefits, so it will not have any impact. Then my second speaker, excellent presentation of the private sector participation. So here the most the objective of private sector, especially in outreach, any other service oriented activity. So their first bet is on high value, high payoffs. That is their major focus. But how to bring out this one? Bring the focus on neglected crops, especially in semi-arid areas. In those areas, still the private sector penetration is very limited, and their first and foremost objective is to maximize their corporate profits. But a sort of a service-oriented motive should be there. So especially it should reach to the more and more to the neglected sectors.
Just a couple of comments for both the speakers. I thought both were really outstanding in terms of framing the problem and addressing some of the solutions. To Dr. Bina Agarwal, you mentioned specifically a couple of NGOs in India and which are operational and functional and have had good success. For example, Pradhan and Kudambashri. I was wondering, why has such movements not taken up in more stronger manner here? Why aren't there more Pradhans? Why aren't the Kudambashri was a success, is a success? Why is it not adapted in more states, especially where the eastern part of India was a tremendous problem? That's something which I would like to really, we are very interested in that approach and like to understand a bit more. To Marco, again, an excellent presentation coming from private sector. I just applaud the effort that Syngenta has done in this regard and moving forward. Specifically, in my limited experience in development world, I see a general resistance to private sector when you go and talk to many of the research communities. I really feel I do not know what ICRISAT or the organizations can do. I think they can do a lot more to bridge the gap. In a context like India, where there is so much private sector boom in terms of seed industry or other technologies, including biotechnology. I'm just wondering what can be really done to leverage the power of the private sector to achieve the common goals that we all have. So just a reflection on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, we can now give chance to our speakers to respond to. First, Meena, you please take.
Thank you. I think firstly on the public land bank, which I hope that brief that I distributed, you'd have a chance to follow it and read it. There aren't any, you'll find if you Google public land bank, Spain will come up. They tried it in the Basque region elsewhere. That was very different because there they were talking really government taking land and building a bank and maybe giving access to the corporate world. This is a very different idea. I want to emphasize that. In this idea, the idea is that it will actually reduce transaction costs. There's a question of transaction costs. At the moment, if you just travel around rural Andhra or you travel around rural Kerala, you'll find that every small farmer is actually trying to negotiate for small bits of land, half an acre or 1 acre, with 2 or 3 farmers, often non-contiguous. And there's huge transaction costs involved. And the moment you invest in the land, the farmer might take it back. There's no guarantee. It's completely insecure leases. And there's also transaction costs involved for the person who owns the land. Your son is studying at Princeton, you're a farmer, you don't want to spend your old age farming. You want to lease out the land. You're not going to do it because the tenant might take it. You don't want to let go of the ancestral land. So it actually, by bringing it into the bank, it reduces transaction costs both for the owner as well as for the person leasing it. It's not very different from, suppose you had, those say in Norway or elsewhere, you want to lease out your house, you're not going to have somebody come in, a lot of people come in, you give it to an agent. They actually act as an intermediary. So the idea of having an intermediary, which is one of the ideas that's in this. But the second is that it will protect the smallholder, because your question, I think, is twofold. One of it is linked to the public land bank, that you are able to give your small amounts of land or you lease in land, but it doesn't go to the corporates. But the second is that the idea of forming groups, which is what can be empowering in enabling you to resist pressures on takeover of your land. By, let's say, there's a lot of talk about corporate
takeover of land. There's also governments coming in and taking land for so-called public purpose. India has a law, or is going to be enacting a law. It's already in Parliament. But there are other examples. And we know that only by coming together can you resist it. It's not possible for individual farmers who own 1 acre, 2 acres, 1 hectare, 2 hectares to be able to do that. So the forming of groups is helpful, both to protect, both to access land, to protect what you have, and to make it productive. It seems to me that all those three are embedded in the notion of much more group approach. I want to just take half a minute to disagree with Marco on exactly on this, that to divide up the smallholders and say, well, these are the people who are okay and we're going to link them to value chains. And all the rest can fall under the social security net. Let's give them their and cash transfers. I think defeats the purpose of the discussion, because large proportion of farmers, as we know, 80% have 2 hectares or less, and they can't be reached by the corporate sector, and they're not going to be into contracts. Then I don't think, then all of them can be under NREGA, and so what is left? 17%. Is that what you're going to deal with? And that's not your argument. But that would be the logic of that argument. What I'm suggesting is that you can form aggregates, have the small farmers come together and consolidate and pool their land. It's not such a, just think about it. And if you encourage them to do that, then it is possible for them to actually become a medium-sized farmer in terms of not ownership, but actual cultivation and dealing with markets, crop insurance, and all of that. So let's rethink this. And this is really the answer to this, is it possible to look at the cooperative model and the private sector model? It is possible if you actually enable people to pool their land and their skills and so on, but in a voluntary way, so that you can actually withdraw your food, not like the old social experiments. There's one other question, but I think he needs to very quickly. Why isn't it happening? I mean, this is a very important question. It is happening, but Kudum Shri is on a very large scale. It's done not by an NGO, it's a local government. And there are a lot of enabling features. I think to understand why collective action happens in some areas and not others, ANDHRA has the largest proportion of SHGs. I mean, 80% of self-help groups are in Andhra Pradesh of all of India. And we need to look at the nature of social capital, what is it that brings people together, what is it that creates trust, reciprocity, and so on, to create the enabling environment for properties. I think it is possible to extend it, but when not.
Thank you. I have to be brief about the Naroda, right? By definition. So first of all, 2 minutes. So first of all, it's always good to have a little bit of constructive disagreement on a panel like this, because it's not interesting if we agree on everything. Now, so therefore, I disagree a little bit, probably a little bit. So yes, it is possible to link smaller farmers to the market. I think that the question of consolidation is actually, or the option of consolidation is actually a very good one. Together with organization at the time, I use the term producing together and selling together. And it's just that I also would like to just inject a note of realism in the sense that there are some farmers that probably won't link at all because, for example, what have you. Given today's infrastructure realities, infrastructure, of course, there's a lot of investment in infrastructure, and what's true today may not be true 5 or 10 years down the road. This links to the third and the fourth question that I was asked, which had to deal with bringing the private sector to neglected areas. And I'd like to say, first of all, that some of it is of course already happening. If you read Pray and Narayana and 2012 paper on private ag research and seed outreach to seed market growth in India, they're saying that private sector hybrids, they're saying that 75% of all area planted to hybrids is planted to proprietary hybrids in the country, in other words, the private sector. And some of that is clearly present in many areas and being used by small-scale farmers. Second comment that goes in the same direction is to recall that actually the Indian seed industry, of course, doesn't only deal with hybrids and biotech crops, but very much deals also with OPVs, and those are candidates for more of the smaller scale, lower capability electric sector. The second answer to the question is, of course, how can we have more of that? Because we need here and elsewhere much more of this. And the method that I have to propose is PPPs. What will be in this case the purpose of public-private or for-profit, non-profit cooperation? It will be to help the big commercial actors such as, for example, seed and input companies overcome uncertainty with respect to the size of the market to begin with. It would be about creating trust and overcoming prejudice, which is a prejudice point, because that typically, or at least very often, cannot, the argument with respect to any benefits from the private sector are probably not necessarily incredibly if they come from the private sector alone. So we've got to talk about this in stakeholder arrangements. Secondly, provide upfront financing. That's what foundations are doing, for example, and bring in NGOs, civil society, farmer organizations to talk about, to jointly develop the market. It's very much about jointly developing the market, and we haven't seen enough of that. And that is why, of course, there are many smallholders out there that are unreached. Now, with respect to the first question, what segments in the technology, services, and access to market spectrum is the private sector particularly strong? Well, in this country, it's already, of course, very strong in terms of seed and other input markets. All of fertilizer, or very, at least a very large part of fertilizer distribution, all of mechanization goes through private channels. Extension, too, as my data are showing, but the question there that keeps coming up, and this relates to the earlier topic of trust, right? Has to do with what is the quality of information given to farmer by input disseminators and input dealers. And there's two hypotheses there, and I would hope that ICRISAT's social science research department will do a study on this, because I cannot do it as Syngenta Foundation for obvious reasons. What are the two hypotheses? The first is that the input dealers are just trying to peddle their wares and maximize their sales, not irrespective of the, I'll be done in 30 seconds, irrespective of the effect of what they're selling in farmers' fields. The second hypothesis is to say no. Input dealers are respected members of their community. Their business model depends on the quality of what they sell, and so they have every incentive to be selling high quality, productive stuff that will lead to desired results. I have not seen here or elsewhere a neutral survey-based study on this question to test those two competing hypotheses. And so what people are saying is, depending on which belief camp that they're sitting in, they'll say this or the other, or go for the other interpretation. I would vote for an empirical verification of this particular topic, and perhaps it could be something that ICRISAT could take on in the context of IMO. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both our speakers and for also the audience for your active participation. I'm supposed to conclude, and I have very little time to do that, but since this responsibility has been given, I would like to say that if we look at the title again of this symposium, how can a smallholder farming feed the world? I would say yes, they will feed the world. One answer is this. Let's to be little more on positive side. No doubt, a question was also raised by Veena in the beginning that are smallholders a drag, and they will remain drag if they cannot be empowered and supported. The other point is that whether they would also promote economic growth. And I again will say yes, they would promote economic growth, but they would need technology, they would need reorientation of agriculture research to have smallholder farmer in the front stage and to work in farmers' participatory approach. You would also need knowledge. And chairman of Farmers Commission in Haryana, which is one of the progressive states, I can tell you, which also came out very clearly from both presentations, the farmers need knowledge. Much can be done if we can strengthen the extension system, the advisory system. And that system somehow has become weak. And when you talk of technologies for smallholder farmers, where risk is involved, where policies are involved, certainly you need more capable technology agents where dissemination losses can be eliminated to the minimum. And in that respect, I see that we need a different breed of technology agents to be built who can provide customized services and through vocational training. So we will have to give more emphasis on advisory services and how they can be strengthened. There is role of NGO, there is role of farmers, there is role of private sector, and all in that context, including discussions and policymakers. I would also draw your attention to 2-3 messages which came out from the global conference on agriculture research for development that was held in 2010. And first was that reorientation around smallholder farmers as far as agenda for research and development is concerned. Second, that you need the systems approach for research and development. You cannot empower farmer by just telling him only about crops or for that matter, one particular commodity. So farmer will have to be empowered through systems approach and diversification in agriculture, which was very clearly highlighted in the morning session. And the third one is we need investment. And investment has to be deferred. The message from Asia which we got was that it has to be deferred. For the first time, Planning Commission has agreed to allocate 2.5 times the allocation to ICR this time for the 12th time. So message has to go to the policymakers, and we have to see that investments in that respect. But what is happening is that the public investments in say marketing, the services relating to agriculture are declining. And private sector, which we expected to come forward more effectively, seem to have been not coming that aggressively, or which possibly they need enabling environment. So we have to see what kind of policy environment could be created so that there is input from the private sector effectively for delivery, for credit, or whether it is insurance. All these are needed for smallholder farmers to bring in resilience. And I won't go on and on this, but would like to say that the most important point is that we need now translational research. We need innovation. We don't intend to go on doing research for the research sake. We need this to be translated. We need this to be outscaled. And outscaling of innovation or impact on a smallholder farmer is most important question today, which has to be addressed. And this is what is the theme of the second global conference, which we are going to organize in Uruguay in October this year. And there are the 3 issues which again are important, that you need foresight. So you have to have foresight, whether it is cooperative, what kind of cooperative, what kind of foresight, how it will be relevant, how farmers will be able to come together, self-help group, companies, or any other method. These are the issues which would require again certain analysis, what kind of foresight on land issues, what kind of foresight on others. The other is that you need partnership. We cannot work and do everything alone. And there we need partnership. And the third one is capacity building, which seems to have been ignored lately. So you need to reorganize education system. You have to also see that you have more capable people available to serve these smallholder farmers. So I think we had a good discussion, we had good presentation, good messages. I won't like to repeat what both the speakers have said. You have already noted them, but I would like to say that thank you for covering this subject from two perspectives, but both are important. So let us give big hand to both the speakers. And, I would like to say I don't want to be in between you and a good lunch which is being organized, but they have